I've had a few strange encounters over the years, but this one took the cake. It happened about 1.5 years ago, a Sunday evening around 6 p.m. I'd had a big one the night before, so I'd spent my Sunday chilling in bed watching Netflix and dozed off maybe 30 minutes before this happened. I woke up to a knock on the front door. First, to explain, my bedroom was originally the foyer of this house, so the front door opens into my bedroom. Weird, I know. It used to be a huge house, but then the landlord subdivided it and turned anything and everything into a bedroom and rented each room out separately. So the front door was like my own private entrance, and everyone else in the house used the back door, which went through the backyard that had a gate leading out onto the street. So I wake up to a knock on the front door. I assume that it's a food delivery for one of my housemates. They usually come to the front door, and if I'm not there or don't answer, they'll try calling whoever ordered, and who will tell them to come around the back. Because I'd just woken up and was still quite hungover, I figure I'll ignore it and let them arrange to meet at the back gate. After a couple of knocks, it stops and I just start to drift off again. Maybe 5 minutes later, I wake up again but don't open my eyes. I have this weird feeling though in my gut that I've never had before, that I'm not alone in the room. I lay there, eyes closed for a second, and just listen. And I can hear rustling sounds coming from my left, where my room's interior door from the living room is. And I soon realize that somebody is going through the contents of my shelf. At first, I think it might be one of my housemates looking for my bud and not wanting to wake me. But the more I listen, the more I realize that something just isn't right. I open my eyes, sit up very suddenly, turn to my left and say who's there. It's then that I see something that sends a shiver down my spine. A man, probably in his late 30s, with a very big build and dressed in black, is standing right over my bed. I have no idea who the hell this guy is, and I've never seen him before. And as soon as he sees me wake up, he mutters shit and disappears out the interior door into the house, closing the door behind him. Suddenly, I'm alone in my room and everything is quiet and normal. Bear in mind, I've just woken up and wasn't even sure if I was really awake or anything. I spent a few moments questioning whether that really just happened, decided that I definitely wasn't dreaming, and ran out into the living room. The guy is gone, but the back door is open and still swinging gently. I run out into the backyard just in time to hear the back gate slam closed. The gate is down an alleyway that's concealed from view by a fence. I head back into the house and check to see if anything is missing, and nothing seems to be. I ran around checking my housemates, who were all in their rooms. The guy in the room next to me confirmed that he heard knocking on the front door a few minutes earlier, but beyond that, nobody had a clue what I had just witnessed. My best guess is that this guy was looking to rob the house. I knocked on my door to check and see if anyone was there, but there was no answer, and so he comes in the back and heads straight for my room as he knows that it's empty, which he can't be as sure of regarding the other rooms in the house. It's a 5-bedroom after all. When he comes in, he sees me asleep and decides to tempt fate by trying to grab what he can without waking me. But in order for him to know the layout of the house this well, he would have almost definitely have to have seen the inside before. I don't know what that means for me, but I know sure as hell that I'll be changing those locks. So this happened to me about a year ago, 2 at most. A friend of mine named Tate moved, and eventually I went up one weekend overnight to visit him. Now, Tate and I, we like to play video games, watch movies, typical stuff, but we also really enjoyed going outside and exploring. In his old neighborhood, there was actually a creek that we would explore for hours. So, the next morning when we woke up, I asked him if there was anything like that around his new house that we could check out during the day, and to my excitement, there actually was. About a mile or so from his house, there's this 7-Eleven, and adjacent to it is a huge field that leads into the woods. So, we got some drinks, and once traffic died down, we crossed the street to the field. At first, I was actually pretty bummed out because this wasn't anything like the creek, and it seemed boring. Until we got to the end of the field, which is where the woods start. We climbed down, and we were in the woods now. There was nothing unusual at first. I mean, I saw a fox dash through the trees and escape in the opposite direction of where we were headed, but that was about it. But these woods were pretty creepy in and of themselves. It wasn't anything huge, but just small things that were out of place. There were styrofoam coolers littered on the ground, broken lawn chairs, a tire, broken glass, and a white tank top tied to a tree. It was just strange, so we joked about how people must have come down here to drink, or how someone must have gotten into a car accident and now lives out here or something. Eventually, though, we got deeper into the woods, and to the far right of us is a house. It's not in the woods itself, it's actually pretty far off, but you could see it from where we were. And honestly, the house looked like complete shit. It was old and looked like it was broken down, and there was a long ladder leading to the roof. On the ladder was a man wearing a reflective orange vest and baseball cap, so we couldn't see his face well, and also he wasn't too close, so we didn't worry too much. But he actually saw us, and he stared at us for a while, and we kept moving forward. We eventually get basically to the end of the woods. We reached the fencing which separated us and the woods from the streets and cars. My friend had to take a leak, and after 30 seconds, we decided to head back to his house. I was a little disappointed, to be honest, because the creek at his old house was way more entertaining, and I liked the water there. We were walking and talking, and we were getting near to his house when we heard some leaves crunch somewhere behind us. We turned around, and it was the man from the ladder at the house. We didn't say a word, and he just stared at us. He wasn't close, but I had a bad gut feeling, and we turned around and started walking quickly towards the field. We hear twigs break and leaves crunch behind us, and I turn my head as I'm walking, and it was the man again. He was definitely following us and wasn't saying a single word. Both times when I turned around and saw him, he didn't walk too. He just kind of stood there and looked at us. At this point, we're basically sprinting, and we run up the incline to get back onto the field and out of those woods. After we got out of the field and saw cars and the 7-Eleven, we both felt relieved and we stopped. I turned around to face the woods, and he was there again, right at the end of the woods, just staring at us. He didn't climb out and get onto the field, and again, he didn't communicate a single word. He just stood there, staring at us. I took a blurry Snapchat video on my phone, and I thought I saved it, but I can't find it, or else I'd try to upload it. I'm not sure if I can here anyway, but it was far and zoomed in, and all I could capture was his blurry face and baseball cap. To this day, I think about that day in the woods. Tate is a couple of years younger than me, and I'm big, but I'm not that strong, and this was a grown man. He definitely could have tried something if he wanted to. For the life of me, I can't figure out what his intentions were and what the hell he was doing in that forest. If he was just trying to scare us, or if he would have actually hurt us or done something perverse if we didn't start running. Instead, all he did was stare at us, but man, was it creepy. For reference, at the time of this happening, I was 5 years old and male. My family had, and still to this day have, a caravan on a fairly large caravan site in Cleethorpes, on the east coast of the UK. We used to go pretty much every weekend in the summer, and honestly, I loved it. We knew pretty much everyone who had caravans in the near vicinity to ours too. But 2 caravans away was a fairly old man, Mike, around 60 at the time I'd say, and his wife, who struggled to walk at the time. My dad and Mike were pretty good friends and had worked together at one stage. Because of this, we regularly went around to theirs and vice versa, and did a lot of things together whilst there. My memory of the day in question is pretty vague, as I was 5 at the time, and my parents have been reluctant to fill me in on many of the other details. So, we were all sat on Mike's balcony at the front of his caravan, and he decided to go in and make some drinks. From what my parents have told me, he then asked me to go in and help make the drinks or help bring them out. Of course, I went in, and I remember the exact moment when he put his hand over my mouth. I was just getting cups from one of the low-down shelves and felt his hand go over my mouth, in the classic horror story type of way, to stop you screaming. At first, I remember thinking that he was just messing around. We did that sort of thing often, and I'm pretty sure Mike had some sort of military background, so I just assumed it was a joke. But then he started leading me through towards the back of his caravan. My memory is also pretty vague of what went on in the next few moments. I'm not really sure if I briefly passed out because at this moment, he still had his hand covering my mouth, but the next memory I have is my dad barging through the door, smashing Mike against the wall, grabbing me and running out of the caravan. At the time, I had no idea what was going on, but I've recently learned that apparently he had chains set up on the bed. Every time I think about it now, I get chills, but still wonder why he would attempt something like that when both my parents and my older brother were sat just meters away. My dad says that he got us all back to the caravan and then stormed back. I don't remember any of this, and nor does my brother, but my mum has told me the exact same story, and by the time that he got back, Mike had managed to get his wife in the car and they just sped off. They apparently left their caravan unlocked and left all their possessions, and my dad said that they never called the police because he actually wanted to beat Mike up, and honestly, I actually believe him. Even now at 62, he could easily take someone out. From what my mum has told me since then, they, Mike and his wife that is, never went back to the caravan, and it was replaced soon after with another. We still have our caravan, although now with me and my brother living away, we only go a few times a year. But looking back, this is one of the only 2 times in my life when I've been in serious danger. I still don't know what the hell Mike was up to that day, and why he took me at the back when it was so obvious that I'd be missing. But whatever the case, it really creeps me out to think about it. I've never told anyone this story because, honestly, I never thought that anyone would believe me. I was home alone one evening and had gone to sleep for the night. I live with my SO and my 2 indoor cats, but she was out of state travelling for business. I woke up in the middle of the night. I wasn't sure of the time, but it was completely dark, because my body was freezing cold. I actually like it cool when I sleep and usually have the temperature around 70 degrees or colder since I live in central Texas. But this, it was different. I was cold, but wrapped in blankets. It was the middle of summer, so evenings aren't cold here. And when I grabbed my phone to look at the time, it seemed to be off, and I pressed the on button, but it didn't turn on. Since I was half asleep, I just shrugged it off, and I walked out of my bedroom to go adjust the thermostat and noticed that the cats weren't around. This was weird because these furballs are always hanging out on the bed and around the bed. Anyhow, I walked to the thermostat and tried to adjust it, but the power to the thermostat, I have a Nest, was nil, and the power to the house seemed to be off. I peeked out of the upstairs window to see if any of my neighbours were having any power issues and noticed that all of their outdoor lights were working just fine. From the time that I woke to this moment was probably 1 to 2 minutes maximum. I decided to wander downstairs to grab some water, but am startled when I realise that there's a glow of light coming from the first floor. The way my house is situated, I couldn't see the light until I approached the stairs. I found this odd because the power seemed to be out just upstairs, which didn't make a lot of sense. So I started walking down the stairs and began to hear a faint humming noise. The noise had a high pitch to it with arbitrary pulses of low sounds, almost like a muffled weed whacker that someone is throttling at random. As I continue to walk down the stairs, I spot a dark, slowly moving figure in the room with light at the bottom of the stairs. The next step that I take feels like I've walked off the side of a cliff or sucked into the floor. That's really the best way that I can explain it too, because I don't remember what happened after that. I just lost all feeling from my body. My next memory is waking up again to the sound of my phone's alarm, and everything seemed back to normal. I sat there in bed, the cat's back to being lazy in bed next to me, and tried to think about the 2-minute incident that happened in the middle of the night. I am not a sleepwalker, and I was definitely not dreaming. My security systems app shows the time whenever a door is opened or closed, and I realized that my security system was disarmed on the app and that the front door had been opened and closed several times throughout the night too. I pulled up my security footage from the exterior cameras and was surprised to learn that there was zero footage from the night. Like, the motion sensors reacted to a random car driving by around 10 PM, and then the next thing is another random car in the morning. So, someone or something walked in and out of my front door, but the cameras didn't capture any footage. My neighbour across the street had a good security system that points at my house, so I asked him if I could review the footage from his cameras. I told him some made-up story about how I thought someone had broken into my truck. Anyway, he said it was weird because when he pulled up the footage from that night, his cameras didn't record anything either. Just a time gap once again. My first thought was that I was sleepwalking and that the memory was a dream, but it just couldn't have been. When I looked out of the window in the middle of the night, I distinctly recall a red pickup truck parked the wrong direction in front of the neighbour's house. I always notice when cars are parked left wheel to the curb because I've gotten a ticket for this in the past. The truck was not there before I went to sleep, based on the footage, but was there in the morning, based on the footage again. So, the truck was there when I saw it in the middle of the night, which means I definitely woke up in the middle of the night, cold as ice, no cats, no working phone, or no thermostat, saw the truck out of the window, and then got warped by something on the stairs. A couple of additional things were different in the house too. The security system was disarmed, and I definitely armed it before going to bed. The light was still on downstairs, and that was absolutely off before I went to bed. My whole body as well smelled like burnt marshmallows. I know this is weird, but it's really how it smelled. And lastly, my 55-gallon fish tank that sits at the bottom of the stairs in the entryway was missing 2/3 of the water. I mean, seriously, where the hell did 40 plus gallons of water just disappear to? The whole area around the tank was bone dry too, and the fish were fine. I seriously don't know what the hell happened, but I've done some research and I've looked into this since then, and everything seems to point towards some sort of abduction experience. Back in 2007, age 19, I moved from my hometown to the nearest big metropolitan to attend university. I had spent most of the previous summer working 2 jobs, including one at a medieval store, part of a bigger chain. We sold outfits, swords, jewelry, gargoyles, and all sorts of figurines and knickknacks too. I had been a really good employee during my tenure, and when I told my manager that I was moving and had to quit, he very kindly mentioned that one of the stores from the chain actually needed an employee right in the city that I was moving to. Needless to say, I was pretty thrilled about this. He forwarded my CV to the manager in the other store, and she replied that she'd gladly take me on as soon as I moved. So, summer goes by and I move to the big city, and in September I start working off the new location. But first, let me describe the surroundings a bit. The store was located in the oldest part of town, and considering the city is 375 years old, those buildings have a lot of history. The street was long and narrow and cobbled, very busy in the summer, swarming with tourists. The store was on the bottom floor of a tall, very narrow building. The store's dimensions were like 16 feet wide for 65 feet deep, approximately, with 25 feet tall cathedral ceilings. The top floors were occupied by a busy bar or pub. There was only one door, spilling out directly onto the street, flanked by a big display window where we would put mannequins dressed in our wares. The very back of the store had another mannequin-adorned display window, but no door, since the street parallel to ours was actually 35 feet below. That part of town had been built on a very sloped land, so every street going down to the river was lower than the other. This is pretty important to the story. There's this one access to the store, and that's through the front door. The minute I stepped into the store, I immediately felt that something was off. It was stifling in there, like the air was heavy. I was immediately uneasy, but I couldn't exactly spit on a job that actually paid well, where I knew what to do, and quite well, and that worked out with my student schedule, so I just tried to bury my concerns and got to work. I got along really well with my new co-workers. I became good friends with the manager, and the money was good and things were going swimmingly. But boy, was I feeling on edge whenever I had to work or close up shop alone. The store was dark and long and narrow, lined with gargoyles, mirrors, swords, and mannequins. But to close, you had to go all the way in the back, in the storage room, flip off all the breakers, and then head back all the way to the front of the shop in pitch darkness to get out through the front door. Needless to say, I pretty much sprinted out of there as soon as the lights were off. Now, we could chalk all of this uneasiness to the actual decor and architecture of this place, but not once did I feel any of that in my old store back in my hometown. And it had also been in the older part of town in a truly ancient building. Nothing tangible happened for a month or two. I was feeling weird and uneasy, but couldn't say with any kind of certitude that something actually was there. And then, around late fall, around Halloween actually, I know, cliche as fuck, stuff started happening. I was opening the store one morning, and as I entered the shop, a massive gargoyle that had been on a shelf at least 16 feet up was in the middle of the floor. like it had been put there on purpose, facing the door. And that was not a light gargoyle by any means. Needless to say, I was a little unnerved. After that initial event, I would find stuff misplaced all the time. Things finding themselves in weird places, like figurines in our bathroom, things on shelves switching places, hanging things crashing to the floor with no warning whatsoever. And then there were the steps. The floor of the store was old, worn hardwood that was very creaky and unforgiving. The slightest weight on it would make it crack and creak in the most obvious way, and it would start cracking all the time, even if no one visible anyway, was stepping on it. There were many instances of hearing steps when I was just standing behind the cash register, doing my thing. One night, I was working with my manager, let's call her Jay, and I let it slip that some weird things were happening. I was expecting her to laugh and reassure me that I was making things up, but the face she made definitely let me know that I wasn't the only one experiencing things. And she spilled everything. She told me about things moving, furniture rattling, steps, things flying off shelves, and feeling of a deep uneasiness. The unsettling thing, though, is that Jay is one of the most skeptical people I know, and even she was a little freaked out. So, right there and then, I had confirmation that at least some of my experiences were completely outlandish. I worked there through winter, and things had stabilized in some way. Stuff was still happening, but I had started to get used to it and would just be mildly annoyed when I'd come in the morning and find things in odd places. But by the time that summer rolled around, however, things had started escalating. Whatever was inhabiting the space had decided that moving things wasn't enough. It decided to start messing with us. Not just with me too, but the whole staff started experiencing things. Even my manager, with the sensitivity of a teaspoon and the most skeptical of employees, was starting to freak out. An employee that I'll name C came in one morning, and she was sweeping the floor by the changing cabins that were covered in large mirrors, and she swore that she briefly saw a figure that definitely wasn't her in the reflection. When I got to work later that day, she was standing behind the cash register by the door, and it looked pretty shaken. She basically hadn't moved all day, too scared to get close to the mirrors, and honestly, I didn't really want to either. She told me how she'd brushed all of the little things off, but that was definitely something she'd never experienced before, and she was really freaked out. Another employee, E, was definitely not the scaredy type. A big guy, very skeptical in his ways, and definitely scoffed at our concerns. Well, one night, as he was closing with our other male employee, H, he felt a very cold and very solid hand between his shoulder blades pushing him. It was the most physical thing that ever happened to any of us directly, and I find it very interesting that it picked one of the most skeptical out of all of us to manifest like that. In any case, E was obviously seriously freaked out, and just tried to explain it away, but of course, how the hell do you justify an ice-cold hand pushing you in the middle of a store with nothing near you? He was actually very tall too, towered over all of us by a head, so whatever touched him had to be tall too. H, who was present and standing behind the cash register a good 12 feet away in front of E, didn't see anything touch him. H, incidentally, had one of the scariest experiences too. It happened the summer before I started working. On a busy night, he was wrapping something for a client behind the cash register counter. On the wall behind the register, he hung some swords. It was actually the most structurally sound wall in the whole place, so it made sense to hang the heavier swords there, and they were permanently locked in heavy custom-made brackets with padlocks, So you really had to want that sword for us to unlock it because, man, it was a pain in the ass. But for no reason whatsoever, one of the swords fell out of one of the brackets and literally slashed his face, out of nowhere. I mean, we kept those swords religiously locked. The odds of someone leaving a bracket open were slim to none, and even then, they were really heavy swords that needed some force to get off those brackets. Unfortunately, poor H needed to get 4 stitches on his cheek too. He was never the same after the incident too, and was very affected by the vibe in the store. I think he was highly sensitive and definitely picked up on the negative energy in the store too. He quit the following summer because he'd just become too scared of working on his own there. Needless to say, I absolutely didn't want to work by myself either. The only one of us who seemed unaffected was M, the most skeptical of all the staff. M would literally burst out laughing and make fun of us when we spoke about things happening. It's an old building. Things settle. The walls are soft. Someone with a spare key is pulling a prank on you all, etc. She didn't believe anything and thought that we were all collectively freaking ourselves out. And I think that her dismissal angered or bothered whatever was haunting our store, and it may have explained some of the escalation of events. The entity got more aggressive and started literally breaking things. We'd come to work to find things shattered and stuff would hurtle off the walls and come crashing down beside us. We'd hear furniture rattle in the back store and played rock, paper, scissors to find out who would have to go in there to turn off the light breakers in there at night. I was so terrified that when I closed, I pleaded with my boyfriend at the time to come and get me so that I wouldn't have to close on my own. And I was once locked in there during my shift. I was rummaging for a box and the door slammed behind me. The key, which I'd sworn that I brought in with me, was nowhere to be found. Thank God that my manager Jay was there with the spare key to let me out. That also happened to her and to E as well. We were all on edge, well, all of us except for M. That is, until one morning. I got to work and M was already there, and she'd gotten there early to chill and eat breakfast, but when I got there, she was standing in the back of the store and was looking a little freaked out. I asked her what was up, and she told me that when she gotten in, there had been that heavy feeling to the store, like the place was crowded by bad energy. She tried shaking it off, but could not for the life of her feel good or truly alone. She felt watched and was not liking it one bit. I think that the fact that she was actually physically feeling it was what freaked her out the most. And sadly for her, the feeling never really went away. So she also quit in late summer. She was just feeling on edge every time that she worked and not like herself, and literally told us that she felt that if she stayed, she might go crazy or something. Obviously, that definitely did not cheer us up. I mean, our staff was up and leaving en masse. We were scared to work and saw things in mirrors, and even my notably spiritually insensitive manager was feeling like she was going a little insane. Things kept being weird and intense all summer and subsequent fall, and even clients picked up on the vibe. One woman in particular refused to come into the store, claiming that there was something in the store that didn't want us there. And honestly, that freaked me out so much. I felt cagey and on edge all day after that. I was jumpy. I had nightmares. I mean, my sleep was hell. I was also in uni full-time and working full-time, and I was exhausted and just really over it by this stage. By the time that winter rolled around again, I was ready to throw in the towel. Christmas came and went, and after that, it got really dead in our part of town. I live in a really snow-cold winter climate, and most of our clients were summer tourists. In other words, the business literally went dead after December until at least March. So, I spent entire days alone at the store with one of two clients in my entire shift. And man, it was awful. I was waiting to land another job to quit, but then something happened that was the proverbial cherry on the cake. One fateful February day, I'd gone to work knowing full well that I probably wouldn't get a client that day. It was dark, grey and snowing and windy as fuck that day, full on storm mode. Honestly, I wondered why I even bothered showing up. It would have been smarter to just close that day. But my manager was working with me and I decided that I didn't want to leave her alone, so I get to the store and it's dark and gloomy in there and my manager is there already kind of throwing a fit. Apparently, when she looked at herself in the mirror when she'd gotten there earlier, she felt like she wasn't looking at herself. It's hard to explain, but she had the distinct feeling that it wasn't her in the mirror staring back. I'm not sure if that makes sense, but I kind of understood what she meant. She kind of lost it at this point and started just yelling at whatever was there to leave us and to stop messing with us. It had basically just happened as I arrived, and for the rest of the day, we were both jumpy and on edge. Of course, there wasn't a single client, and it was mid-afternoon, dark outside because the sun sets early in the winter, so it was dark indoors too, and it was just plain miserable. We were sitting in the middle of the store, where there was a decorative couch that we actually used all the time, and lacing a big pile of bodies that we'd gotten earlier that week, when we heard one of the tables in the back of the store rattling. When my manager went to check, she called me over, and an entire display of little leather pouches that had been painstakingly arranged on the table had been just tossed right off. Little pouches were everywhere, and the table was askew, and there were long scratches that had been gouged into the surface. Not deep by any means, but they were definitely there. And obviously, we freaked the fuck out at this. And that's when my manager noticed that the mannequins in the back display window, they were facing inside the store and not out as they should have been. She asked me if I had moved them today, and obviously I hadn't. The only time that we would actually move those was when we changed their clothes. No one could have possibly moved them since the only door to the store was all the way at the opposite end. I then noticed that every single mannequin in the store was actually turned towards us, including the ones in the front display window. How or when that happened, I'll never know. I mean, I still have no explanation to this day. If it was a prank, it was so well orchestrated that I wonder what kind of mastermind had this much time to waste, scaring the fuck out of a little team of hapless teenagers and young adults just trying to get by. I mean, my hands are shaking even talking about this. But to this day, it's definitely one of the scariest things that has ever happened to me. Realizing that all the mannequins have been turned towards us, it gave me a heart attack. I still get major shivers whenever I tell people about this experience too. I felt watched and so unsafe that it was horrifying. My body was in fight or flight mode and I felt physically ill. I had to get out of there, and not a minute too soon too. And that's pretty much when I decided that it was enough. I pretty much told my manager, okay, that's it, I've had enough and I'm leaving this place and never coming back. Fuck this, I'm going home. But she didn't want to stick around either, so we just grabbed all our shit and left right there and then. Didn't turn off the breakers, didn't do any closing procedure. We just got our shit, put the key in the door and hightailed it out of there. And After that day, I never went back. The owners decided to close for the remainder of the winter the week after that, and we all got an unemployment benefit until we found new jobs, and when they opened again in April or something, I told my supervisor when he called me offering me a job that I'd rather literally die than set foot in that store again. I walk in the front of the old building a few times a year when my errands take me to the old part of town. They closed the store permanently a few years ago, and to this day, it remains vacant. I ran into the barmaids and waiters that worked upstairs a few times. We'd often chat on our respective porches when we got out to smoke back when I worked there. Last summer, I was walking on the street below the shop and ran into one of the barmaids. We started catching up, and she was telling me how our old store was still vacant, and that whoever visited it, to open something in it, would back out of it last minute or change their minds. I decided to bite the bullet and ask her if anything strange or uncanny had ever happened in the bar, at the risk of looking a little strange. And she looked at me with big eyes and nodded. She said, all the time. The chairs flying, bottles shattering, barmaids and waiters hearing weird sounds at night, doors closing of their own volition, and a plethora of others. We exchanged stories for a good hour after that. I'm quite convinced that that entire building is haunted or something, and honestly, it wouldn't surprise me in the least in that part of town where most of the buildings are 200 plus years old. I never quite knew what it was that was there, what its motivations were, but one thing was for sure. It definitely did not want us there. Let me mention that I'm kind of a scientist at heart. I would never label myself a skeptic by any means, but I do love a good logical scientific explanation. If I could have debunked any of the events I mentioned, I would have gladly done it. But there are no words and not a single explanation that I could possibly have for that horror and the sense of dread and the events that unfolded where I worked there. And even now, nearly 10 years later, you could never pay me enough to set foot back in there. Not in a million years. Since high school, I've learned that some of the most rewarding purchases are the most annoying transactions. When I was about 17, I decided to get my driver's license because I was tired of spending so much time at my house with my parents. They weren't bad people or anything, but my mum liked to yell at the political news channel with my dad, and it got old fast. After I got my license, I was using a text service called QWERTY, which had gone out of business, and I was left without a phone. Because having a cell phone had been decided necessary by my parents, I had to go purchase my own. They would pay for it, and I would work around the house to pay them back, but I had to get it and do all the hard work. I didn't live in a bad area, but the Radio Shack was in a sketchy part of town where a lot of prostitution and drug dealers ran their businesses. I never remember hearing of anyone getting hurt, but the people, they were definitely really sketchy, and one apartment down the road on the way to the Radio Shack absolutely was dangerous. It was a popular place for opioid addicts and drug dealing. It was closer to my house than I like to admit, and I didn't think anything of it most of the time. So I'm at the Radio Shack, and people keep making the process difficult. Between the girl who first checked me out and started activating the phone, to her not only activating the wrong phone but bricking it, it was a long process. Finally though, we get all set up and they're telling me to set up security on my phone and a backup passcode. I do, but it's one of those swipe pattern codes, and I ended up forgetting it the second I got back into my dad's truck. I was driving back at about 8 PM and I have to stop at the intersection by the drug den apartments. I'm approaching from the east going west, and the road is barren except for two other people also driving west. The one truck turns right to head north, and a man is standing at the northwest corner, waiting to cross going east, past us. The orange PT Cruiser ahead of me has stopped at the red light, and we're waiting to go. The truck turns, and I didn't take note of the pedestrian, but the light is green and we haven't moved. I wait for a second before I look to honk the horn, and the car ahead of me backs up a bit, scaring me and making me full panic. I'm new behind the wheel, and I don't put the car in reverse. I put it in park, and I'm pressing on the gas but not moving. I'm trying to figure out what gear I'm in, but I can't find the display in my panic, and the orange PT Cruiser takes off. I'll never forget the guy that was standing in the road ahead of me. I still worry about him walking around when I have to drive around that town at night. He was about 5'6", slim with long limbs and a sunken face. His whole body screamed zombie, and his face was twisted in anger. He wore a dirty neutral coloured hoodie, but in the dark, I couldn't tell much. I managed to lock the doors, but still couldn't figure out the gears. I was totally frozen, staring at this man slinking toward me. He put his hand on the hood of the car, and it's cracked and bruised and dirty. I muster enough courage to look at him in the face, and I'll never forget seeing how much blood was just dripping off of him. I couldn't tell if he was badly injured because his face was just so dirty and bloody, but I had more than enough time to look. He crept up to the driver's side and tried to find the handle as I was trying to figure out the gears. I managed to pop it into neutral, and the truck made a strange noise that took him aback, but I wasn't moving, and he slammed his face against the window. He looked like he was bleeding from his eyes, but he definitely wasn't in pain. I mean, he laughed as I was panicking, and I could hear him tugging on the handle. Somehow, no other cars had stopped to help, even though I saw them passing by. I managed to find the right gear and tried to take off, but for some stupid fucking reason, I wanted to be a decent person and not run him over, so I took off slowly. I barely pressed on the gas when he pulled out a gun. I shrieked and slammed the gas and dragged him a bit. He had his arm wrapped around the side mirror and he yelped and let go. I took off going 60 down the 35 to my house, and when I got in a full-on panic, my mum just chastised me for barging in like I did. When I tried to explain it, to my shame, I started to throw up and had to run to the bathroom. When I came out and explained, they told me to quit being a pansy and call the cops. For some reason, I was in trouble for almost being carjacked. I called the police, and the dispatcher said that I wasn't the only one calling about a man with bleeding eyes. After telling my parents, to which my mum was, well, gently put, skeptical, the doorbell rang. A deputy was at my door and asked to speak with me. My mum sent me in front of the officer, hoping that I'd confess to staging a hoax or apologize, and he asked me for a description. I gave him one and took him to the truck to show him the bloody face print on the window. He had someone take a sample, and he told me that they had a suspect in custody who perfectly matched my description of the man. He had a road rash and a dislocated shoulder, but wasn't in any mortal harm or anything. The cop left me with the number of his badge and squad car and told me to call him if I ever needed help with this again. He later appeared on the local news, giving a statement to a string of attempted carjackings by a man who was reported to be on cocaine. He said that with the help of the people who gave statements and descriptions, and the fact that he had a unique injury, finding the correct guy was pretty easy. He was carrying a loaded handgun that had not been fired, and no one but him was injured. The deputy said that the man had been in a fistfight nearby, and had gotten beaten bloody, and the strange appearance of blood from his eyes was from ruptured blood vessels in his eyes, and blood from his cheeks. He said that the man was in a stable condition and cooperating. He was sentenced on a drug charge, and I haven't heard anything about it since. But needless to say, when he pulled that gun, it scared the shit out of me. My dad lives in an old miners' village, and lots of artifacts have been found, like an old key from under the floorboards or a note to a miner's wife in the walls of another house. He moved in when I'd gotten older and has only lived there for about 3 years now. Weird stuff has always happened in that house, but there's been some instances which made me question my previously non-believer stance on the paranormal. I've always relied on science and evidence in life, and I truly believe that the simplest explanation is usually the right one. The events that I'm going to talk about, however, I can't reason as being natural and don't know what to do about them. The first event that seemed off in that house was a tall man that would pass the kitchen window. I would never pay much attention, as I figured it would just be a neighbour passing by, and I would continue to cook whatever I was making, giving them a smile through the window due to the friendly nature of such a small community, which he would always return. I didn't know the names of the locals, since I only visited my dad once a week, and we spent our time in the house watching movies alone, so there was never a chance to get to know people. Being good friends with his neighbours, though, we agreed to go over for dinner, since he had been there for a few months now, and I hadn't had the chance to sit down with them and talk. Over dinner, we discussed different boring topics such as unemployment, school, and the weather, until we were a couple of glasses into wine. A good-natured gossip about the neighbours began, and I started to try and place faces with names. They seemed to stop after a while, which seemed weird, as they hadn't mentioned the one person that I was most familiar with. I began to describe the man who walked by regularly, from his height to his bone structure, and everyone sat in confused silence, as nobody turned up in this village without people noticing. The mother of our neighbour had suddenly jumped up and hurried back to her house. Around 10 minutes later, she came back with a picture of the man that I had seen for weeks now, and I confirmed that, yeah, this was the guy that I had seen, and she just nodded. She told me that his name was James, and he used to live in our house, but a few years ago, he drove down the road into the forest and attached a pipe to his exhaust, and then went through the window, and they found him days later. Naturally, I thought that she was just joking around, or that she had gotten confused due to her old age or something. But it wasn't until our neighbour hummed and said that she remembered the last woman who had moved in for a few months had complained about the man who always walked around outside too. Apparently, she had loudly told him to go away after getting advice from her priest, and he hadn't bothered her again. She apparently moved out though, because the house felt off to her. I never had the heart to say it whenever I saw him, because as far as I cared, he wasn't doing any harm. And the second event is also pretty tame, but I still have no explanation, so it gives me chills. Being a smoker, but not being fond of the smell, I usually head outside to spark one up. I'd been having trouble sleeping this night, however, and it was around 2 a.m. Not only was I too tired to find the energy to put on appropriate clothing and shoes and trail down the stairs, but I also didn't want to risk waking my dad up since it was way too early. This is why, instead, I hung out my window in order to have a smoke, dressed in nothing but a shawl wrapped around my shoulders for the chill. For reference, the window is in the far wall. On the opposite wall is my bed, toilet to the right and exit to the left. I must have been about halfway through when I heard a man clear his throat very loudly from right behind me. I panic and spin around, thinking maybe that my dad had come up to ask something and was showing his disapproval of my being awake when I had work the next day. In hindsight, though, it obviously would not have been my dad, as firstly, he knows to knock, and secondly, he would never have stayed if he noticed my lack of clothing. When I do spin around, however, nobody is there, which was odd. I easily brush off occurrences like this as just normal, such as when others jump or thump in the house or something, or possibly something moving in the house, so I shrug it off and say that it had to be something falling over. But then I began thinking about how loud and clearly that I heard the noise, so close to me too, that it started to make me feel uncomfortable and a little bit shaken. The third event didn't seem aggressive, just unnatural. It had been the summer and I'd been wearing a very light shawl which I placed on the floor when I went to the toilet. This floor was covered with one large sheet of lino, so no air would be able to flow through the cracks or gaps. As I was sitting there, I had been staring at the ceiling as there was a small spider running laps up there. But movement caught my eye, and looking down, I saw the weirdest thing that I've ever witnessed. My shawl was literally floating right in front of me, a few inches off the ground. It was raised by one part as if someone punched it and then raised their arm. I sat there, pants around my ankles, wondering what the hell I was meant to do. I felt scared to move, as if whatever it was wouldn't notice me if I stayed still. Finally, I reached forward, but the second I made contact with the shawl, it dropped and the entire room became ice cold. The fourth event, it terrified me at the time, and honestly, it still does. It was near the end of summer, so the weather had become calm and warm. My dad and I were watching some movie in the living room downstairs when we both jumped at a bang so loud that we thought it might have been a gunshot. I get the same feeling of dread and pure fear that I got during the voice in my room, and for some reason, I run straight for the door and out of the house. Our neighbour's mother, I should mention now that she's very religious and a strong believer, sees me in such a panic and comes racing out to see what had just happened. I am embarrassingly ugly crying by this point, which again is very uncharacteristic of me, but I've never felt so threatened in my life. I tell her that something happened in the house and she goes to the front door, through which I can see my dad looking about with his baseball bat. The second she steps inside, she turns back around and hurries to her house. She returns with a bundle of sage and lights it as she steps in. She looks about before going straight to my room, and I can hear from outside her shouting at whatever was in there to leave the house as it's not welcome here. After a while, she comes back out and tells me to keep the sage burning in my room as it'll protect me. My dad leads me back inside and points up the stairs, and halfway up, I see that the hatch to the loft had been removed. Now, this thing was far enough up from the ground that no person would have been able to reach it and move it without a ladder. I wait in the kitchen as a neighbour helps my dad fix the ladder and move the hatch. And apparently, this thing was so heavy that my dad struggled to even slide it on his own. Lastly, there were some weird dreams that I had while I was there too. Maybe they're connected, maybe not. I'm not too sure, but I won't go into it. But I attempted to take my own life about a month before this, and I hadn't been to visit in a while due to low moods, but I finally got the energy to go back, and I'd been having nightmares where you can't remember what happened, just that it was bad, but this changed on my first visit. I also want to put it out there that although I'm not discounting it, I've never had sleep paralysis or I've never sleepwalked. The nightmare was simple enough. In my dream, I woke up to whispering coming from the small walk-in closet. This closet was a meter-sized crawl space that looks like it comes from a bad horror movie. In my dream, there was smoke pouring from it and something was hacking loudly as the local radio station played. The light flicked on and an inhumanely deep voice said, "You watch him and he watches you. I watch both." I woke up terrified and covered in sweat. But the weird thing was that the closet light, it was on in the mornings, and I know that it hadn't been. I write this now because I stayed over a few nights ago for the first time in a long time, and I had another really bad dream. When I sleep, I remain curled in a tight ball and never move from my spot. I'd been having a really scary dream about something when I woke suddenly, feeling like something had jerked my ankle. I bolted awake to find myself at the bottom of my bed, closest to the now open doors of my closet, and my ankle in front of me, off the bed. I tell you this because I've never moved like this, no matter what my dream was, and it felt so real this time. I also now have 2 cuts on that ankle which bled overnight, but without any clear reason. What do you guys think? Do you guys think that this is evidence of a haunting? And if so, what the hell should I do? This sounds crazy, but can I make peace with it? Is this entity actually aggressive? And if so, can it do harm to me? Should I have told it to go away while I had the chance? And I guess, most importantly, do you think it's James? So this happened about 6 years ago. It's a story that I've told many times and will continue to tell because, honestly, it was probably the closest that I've ever been to getting killed. Or, if not killed, then kidnapped or something really horrible. The summer of 2012, me and my best friend were hitchhiking around Eastern Europe with no money, like a bunch of crusty punk bums. We were 19 at the time and really bought into that lifestyle, if that's what you call it. We're over it now, though. Without boring with unnecessary details, we were making our way towards Poland from the Baltics and happened to hitch a lift in Lithuania from the Latvian border. The dude who picked us up was really friendly, but he was ultimately going a different direction, and so he dropped us off at this spot that he told us was really good for hitching. He dropped us off, and it was a large concrete area by the side of the road, in the middle of Lithuanian countryside. It was probably designed for truckers to pull in on hindsight and take a nap or whatever. On one side of the road was endless cornfields. The other side was some woods. It was pretty late in the evening and there was no traffic anywhere, so we decided to call it a night, crossed the road towards the edge of the woods and got out our sleeping bags, food, etc. by this small dirt mound near the road, by the woods. As we were unwinding, we heard a woman screaming from across the road. We immediately ran across to see what the hell was going on, and we could just about make out 2 men running away in the cornfields. We stood there in shock, and a few moments later, a car up the road pulled out of the cornfields and sped off into the distance. We just stood there in shock, wondering what the hell to do. Then, a few moments later, a policeman in a car showed up. He asked us questions in Lithuanian, and we explained to him in English that we were just hitchhikers. He said to us that this was a really dangerous place and we shouldn't be here, but then proceeded to roll up the window and drive back the way he came. We were obviously pretty spooked at this point, so we crossed the road back to our bags by the dirt mound on the edge of the woods. My friend had a shitty little rusty penknife, and we agreed to stay vigilant. It was nighttime by this point, and after a while, nothing happened. But we were still a bit scared, and we couldn't really sleep. But then, in the dead of the night, in the woods next to us, we could hear footsteps cracking the twigs and branches of the woods. They slowly got closer and closer towards us too, and eventually they stopped. We heard incessant whispering for a few moments, then heard the footsteps and the twig snapping move slowly away from us. Neither of us needed to say anything to each other because we both knew what had just happened. At this point, we were petrified, and my friend took out his shitty penknife and we just laid there, shitting it and waiting. I remember saying to him, "See you in hell, Connor," and him saying it back to me. An hour or two passed, and we were just laying there, taking turns with a knife, in case we got attacked from different angles, and not knowing what was going to happen. After a while, nothing happened and the exhaustion kicked in, and so we just passed out. But suddenly, we were abruptly woken early in the morning, sunny by this stage, by the sound of a car really aggressively pulling up on the road by the mound that we were sleeping behind. We heard car doors slam and footsteps stomping towards us really quickly. As we were laying down and behind a mound, we couldn't see them, but we could just feel that they were inches away from us. I'll never forget the fear that I felt at that moment. My whole body froze and I simply thought that this was it. But they stopped and we heard a really angry argument in Lithuanian between two men. It went quiet after what felt like an eternity, but in reality was probably 30 to 60 seconds. They just stomped back to their car and drove off. I almost vomited with relief too, and we immediately got up, packed our bags and started walking as far as fucking possible from that area and started hitchhiking again. We're not sure what we were privy to that night, and we don't think it was a sexual assault, or else there would have been more screams. But we think that it was probably a murder. The perpetrators were likely watching us from the woods, whispering. They could have been seconds away from either killing us or kidnapping us the next morning. This all happened 6 years ago, and it's still so surreal thinking that this happened, and that we got away unscathed. I mean, we could have easily been a pile of bones in some unknown Lithuanian forest, never to be found. I'd also like to add as well that before all this happened, there was a weird precursor. We were on the Latvian and Lithuanian border, in a small village sitting on a wall. Before walking to that wall, we walked past a police car with what looked like to be two very heavily asleep police officers, possibly dead even, and some random guy shouting at them through the window. We thought it was strange and sat down on the wall and we watched the event from a distance, before proceeding to roll some cigarettes. We both looked up again about 20 seconds later and they had all just vanished. There was no sight of them anywhere, and it was a massively long stretch of road both ways. We both thought that it was really weird, and we hitched a lift from that wall, and it was a talking point right up until our calamity happened a few hours later. It kind of set the tone for the night, and I know it's kind of an irrelevant detail overall, but I felt that I should mention it because even though we weren't spooked, we were weirded out in a kind of harmless way, right up until shit got real. Anyway, I don't know exactly what happened that night, but something sinister was going on, for sure.